The Royal Albert Hall gleamed under the fading sun, its towering facade bathed in a golden light that seemed almost reverential. Rows of Union Jack flags lined the entrance, fluttering gently in the evening breeze, a proud testament to centuries of heritage. Tonight was a celebration, one meticulously planned over months, a nationally televised spectacle that would showcase tradition, unity, and duty. The audience included dignitaries, military veterans, charity leaders, and foreign royals, each chosen with the utmost care, each playing their part in a carefully choreographed display. Every detail, from the polished marble floors to the fragrant floral arrangements framing the stage, had been scrutinized to perfection. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. At the heart of this orchestrated elegance sat King Charles and Queen Camilla, the nucleus around which the ceremony revolved. Camilla had chosen a deep blue gown that caught the soft hall lights, diamonds flickering with every measured movement. She smiled graciously at the passing guests, nodding to familiar faces with the practiced ease of a queen, her presence flawless. On the surface, projected calm authority, yet for those who watched closely, hints of tension flickered beneath the polished exterior. The orchestra played a gentle prelude, a backdrop to the quiet murmur of anticipation as the master of ceremonies took the stage. The audience fell into respectful silence, sensing that the evening's highlight was imminent. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, was announced, the hall erupted in applause, warm, sustained, almost reverent. She rose gracefully, dressed in a tailored ivory gown that contrasted against the darker hues of the hall, and approached the podium with a poise that commanded attention. Her shoulders squared, head held high, she offered a polite smile that seemed to anchor the room, inviting everyone into her presence. At first, her words followed the expected path, expressions of gratitude, acknowledgments of the organizers, praise for the causes and individuals being honored. Her voice was steady, clear, and perfectly modulated, allowing the hall's acoustics to amplify her calm authority. Cameramen shifted subtly, ensuring multiple angles captured her composed delivery, knowing she would dominate the next days. Headlines. In the royal box, Camilla's smile remained intact, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle rigidity had entered her posture. Even the most practiced observer could detect a slight tightening around her eyes and mouth, a tension that betrayed the Queen's outward composure. As Catherine's speech transitioned from formalities to more profound observations, the air itself seemed to shift. Her tone softened, yet gained a layered depth, drawing the audience in. She spoke of service as more than a duty, of integrity that stands firm when tested, of leadership that privileges the welfare of others over personal gain. There were no accusations in her carefully chosen words, but the phrasing was deliberate, precise enough to stir whispers among those attuned to royal subtleties. Catherine's gaze occasionally flicked toward the royal box, where Camilla sat, her posture immobile, eyes locked on the princess. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in a room attuned to nuance, impossible to ignore. Trust, she spoke of, was the bedrock of any enduring institution. Without it, even the grandest walls crumble. The delivery was calm, almost meditative, but the message's weight was undeniable. Across the hall, attendees leaned forward instinctively, sensing the gravity behind words that seemed directed at no one in particular, and yet unmistakably at someone in particular. The camera lenses caught every fleeting expression. Camilla's controlled smile did not reach her eyes. The faint tightening of her jaw was visible to those paying close attention. King Charles shifted slightly, hands gripping the edge of the armrest, his expression measured but tense. Around them, other members of the royal family maintained their carefully neutral facades, though their eyes betrayed curiosity, even unease. The hall seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the silent drama unfolding between stage and royal box. As Catherine's speech deepened, she spoke of accountability, framing it as an honor rather than a burden. Those entrusted with positions of influence must remain worthy of public trust, she asserted. History remembered those who upheld truth and fairness, not titles or convenience. Every word was layered, the cadence deliberate, the subtleties sharpened to precision. Whispers spread in the audience. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, and backstage producers exchanged knowing glances. Catherine had deviated subtly from the prepared text, adding phrases that amplified the underlying tension in a manner both elegant and pointed. Camilla's composure remained outwardly impeccable, but the slightest cues betrayed her unease. A finger tapped lightly against the armrest, lips tightened ever so subtly, eyes fixed on Catherine with a focus that was almost defensive. Every so often she leaned toward a senior aide, murmuring something without looking away from the podium. Meanwhile, Catherine moved through the rest of her speech with serene confidence, engaging politely with neighbors when not addressing the audience directly, her composure amplifying the contrast with the Queen's silent struggle. The crescendo of her message arrived as she spoke of unity and honesty. Bonds between people, she said, should be strengthened by integrity, not weakened by self-interest. Her voice steadied, measured, unwavering. The applause that followed her final lines was long and deliberate, swelling from the audience before, washing over the royal box. Camilla joined in with polite, rhythmic claps, yet her gaze never wavered from Catherine, an unspoken dialogue playing across the room. It was applause, yes, but devoid of warmth. The subtle tension was palpable. The room had shifted. What had begun as a ceremony of pomp had become a statement, a quiet reckoning. The orchestra began its performance, yet the audience remained half attentive, minds replaying the resonance of Catherine's words. Journalists, dignitaries, and veterans alike could not ignore the deliberate undertones, the implications whispered between lines. Conversations that might have centered on the evening's musical or charitable achievements now circled back to the princess's speech. Observers speculated, was this a gentle warning, a reflection of personal values, or the first step toward a public confrontation? Backstage, aides and producers noted the deviation with both apprehension and admiration. Catherine had taken calculated risks, her edits finalized mere hours before the event. The deliberate precision of her words ensured that the speech landed exactly as intended, a graceful, commanding, and pointed message. The ripple effect was immediate. Attendees exchanged glances, insiders noted familiar patterns, and whispers of prior tensions between Catherine and Camilla resurfaced, now in a context impossible to ignore. As the evening progressed, Queen Camilla's struggle to maintain composure became a quiet spectacle. Her posture remained impeccable, hands folded, polite smiles offered at measured intervals, yet the smallest gestures betrayed her inner tension. Delayed claps, subtle finger taps, taut shoulders. The contrast with Catherine's serene confidence was stark, amplifying the silent drama. Camera operators continued to capture fleeting reactions, each pan emphasizing the dichotomy between polished exterior and underlying strain. Catherine's speech had done more than address the audience. It had rewritten the emotional landscape of the evening. Guests, though outwardly polite, could not entirely mask the sense of witnessing a subtle but undeniable shift in power dynamics. Whispers of past events, combined with the current delivery, painted a complex narrative, a reminder of values, a critique veiled in civility, and a quiet assertion of authority that few could ignore. In the royal box, Camilla remained outwardly composed, yet insiders could detect the undercurrent of unease. King Charles, aware but restrained, did not intervene, allowing the moment to unfold. Across the hall, journalists and dignitaries exchanged speculative glances, noting the deliberate weight behind each carefully chosen word. The orchestral performance continued, yet the evening's tone had irrevocably changed. The audience's minds were occupied not by music, but by the subtle tensions, the intricate dance of influence and authority, and the quiet, yet unrelenting, presence of a message delivered with flawless precision. Even as the night progressed, the impact lingered. Conversations, observations, and whispered analysis permeated the hall. The balance of power subtly questioned, the delicate fabric of royal unity momentarily frayed. The speech had been polite, elegant, and formally impeccable, but beneath the surface, it carried a weight that would echo far beyond the hall, leaving all who witnessed it aware that something significant had shifted. Backstage, the production team and aides reflected on the evening. Catherine's deliberate edits, her poised execution, and the precise delivery of layered messages had achieved a rare feat, a performance of diplomacy, grace, and subtle admonishment simultaneously. The Queen's carefully maintained facade, though outwardly intact, betrayed a private discomfort, signaling a tension that insiders knew was far from resolved. The reverberations of this night would be felt in palace corridors, in private discussions, and in the intricate dance of royal influence for months to come. The evening's final notes, a delicate flourish from the orchestra, filled the hall, yet the silence between guests, the subtle glances, and the thoughtful murmurs spoke louder than music. It was a night of ceremony transformed into quiet reckoning, a reminder that in the realm of royalty, every word, every gesture, and every glance carries a story, a message, and an echo that lingers far beyond the applause. Even as the orchestra's final notes faded into the hall, the subtle glances exchanged in the royal box did not escape attention. Camilla's eyes, sharp and calculating, remained locked on Catherine for a fraction longer than polite etiquette allowed. Every measured movement, a slight tilt of her head, the faint tightening of her lips, hinted at unease, a silent acknowledgement of the message delivered. Prince William, seated beside Catherine, exchanged a brief, knowing glance, signaling quiet approval, while King Charles maintained his composure, though the slight narrowing of his eyes betrayed his concern. The audience, largely unaware of the layers of meaning, remained focused on the lingering resonance of the speech, the words echoing like a pulse through the grand hall. Backstage, the atmosphere was tense, yet buzzing with anticipation. Producers and aides whispered to one another, their words careful and hushed. "She went off script," one murmured, a hint of admiration in his tone. Another countered, "It was subtle, but the timing precise." Among the guests, murmurs began to spread, some speculating about the princess's intent, others replaying the previous year's charity reception in their minds. Every nuance, every turn of phrase was being analyzed, dissected for meaning. Those closest to the monarchy recognized patterns that outsiders could not, a reminder that the palace, polished and grand as it appeared, often concealed undercurrents, far more potent. In the royal box, Camilla's composure remained outwardly intact, yet the signs of internal struggle were undeniable. Her hands, folded neatly, tapped lightly on the armrest, a subconscious rhythm betraying her tension. The slight downturn at the corners of her mouth, the way her shoulders stiffened, and the careful timing of her applause all spoke volumes. Every subtle gesture was a silent attempt to reclaim control over a narrative moment, slipping beyond her influence. Those with an eye for royal body language noted the contrast sharply. Catherine's serene, unshakable presence magnified the Queen's inner disquiet. Across the hall, the audience processed the speech in layered ways. Journalists scribbled furiously, already sensing the headline that would dominate the next day's papers. Veterans and charity workers exchanged glances, a quiet acknowledgement of the values Catherine had highlighted. Foreign dignitaries observed with polite nods, yet the air of tension between stage and royal box was palpable even to those unfamiliar with palace nuances. Conversations, previously casual, now circled back to subtle implications. The event, intended as a celebration of heritage and service, had transformed into a moment of reflection, analysis, and quiet intrigue. Backstage, aides and production staff replayed the moments in hushed commentary. Catherine's edits, made mere hours before the event, had been strategic, ensuring that the speech landed with precision. The subtle yet undeniable focus on trust, accountability, and integrity suggested more than general guidance. It hinted at specific expectations, a veiled reminder for those in positions of influence. The production team exchanged glances, a mix of admiration and concern. The speech had exceeded any prior rehearsal in its impact, quietly shifting the dynamics in the room without a single overt confrontation. As the program moved forward, the orchestra's rich tones filled the hall, yet the minds of those present remained engaged with the implications of the speech. Catherine returned to her seat, composed and serene, while William leaned in briefly, their silent communication a reminder that this display had purpose beyond formalities. Camilla, meanwhile, maintained her posture, but each movement was calculated, an exercise in restraint. Every delayed clap, every subtle glance was a tactical maneuver in a game of perception, a struggle to reconcile personal discomfort with public duty. In quiet corners of the hall, guests speculated on the speech's meaning. Was it a gentle admonishment, a warning, or simply a reminder of shared values? For those attuned to the subtleties of royal life, the answer seemed obvious. The tension between Catherine and Camilla, long simmering, had been made visible without overt confrontation. Conversations whispered in hallways and backstage corridors would continue long after the audience had dispersed, as observers pieced together history, present dynamics, and unspoken expectations. Beyond the hall, the impact began to extend further. Reporters prepared their stories, social media discussions were anticipated, and palace aides already planned responses to questions that might arise. The speech, carefully balanced between decorum and subtle assertiveness, had sent ripples through the institution. Catherine's poise, her choice of words, and her deliberate focus on core values had established a narrative that others could not easily counter. The Queen's controlled discomfort, while not publicized, had been recorded, noticed, and would become a topic of private discussion for months to come. As the evening drew to its formal close, the hall returned to its rehearsed rhythm, yet the memory of Catherine's words lingered. Polished smiles and polite applause continued, but the undercurrent of tension remained. The delicate balance of unity, authority, and influence within the royal family had been subtly altered, a quiet reminder that appearances can conceal far more than they reveal. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully measured word from that evening would continue to echo, a testament to the power of subtlety, the weight of integrity, and the unspoken complexities of royal life. Even in seated moments, Catherine's aura of composure projected power. Her posture was relaxed yet commanding, a silent reminder that influence need not be loud to be felt. She engaged with guests with subtle warmth, her polite smiles conveying appreciation without diminishing the weight of her earlier words. Every gesture reinforced a sense of integrity and control, a quiet authority that subtly contrasted with the Queen's measured but tense demeanor. Camilla, aware of the scrutiny, attempted small adjustments to regain equilibrium. A deep inhale, a slow shift in posture, a carefully timed nod, all performed with the precision of someone trained to mask inner turbulence. Yet the faint shadow of unease remained. Insiders noticed the tension, reading between lines and gestures that would be invisible to casual observers. Even as she joined polite conversation with nearby royals, her eyes occasionally flicked back to Catherine, a subtle war of acknowledgement and containment playing out in silence. Veterans, charity organizers, and dignitaries began discussing not just the performances but the speech's undercurrents. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, recognizing patterns that suggested deeper meaning. Aides whispered about the timing, delivery, and subtle emphasis on key words. Those familiar with palace politics began to interpret the speech as more than ceremonial rhetoric, a strategic display of influence and values, a reminder of moral expectations directed toward the adulterer. As the evening continued, the subtle tension began to ripple beyond the royal box. Conversations among guests shifted from routine commendations to questions of accountability, trust, and leadership. The speech became a reference point for discussions that would carry beyond the event itself. Even as the orchestra performed, minds remained engaged with the implications of Catherine's words, demonstrating how a poised yet pointed address could transform the tone of a formal gathering. Behind the stage, aides and production staff analyzed every moment. The calculated phrasing, the subtle glances, and the choice of examples all indicated a deliberate strategy. Catherine's calm execution contrasted sharply with the Queen's visible restraint, reinforcing the silent narrative of authority and moral clarity. Backstage observers recognized the moment as a masterclass in subtle diplomacy, a reminder that influence often works most effectively when understated yet unmistakable. At intervals, Camilla consulted with senior aides, speaking in hushed tones while maintaining her composed exterior. Even brief exchanges revealed a careful management of impressions, a balance between personal discomfort and public responsibility. The Queen's strategies, though unseen by the majority of the audience, were critical in controlling narrative, perception. Her meticulous attention to timing, posture, and expression illustrated a lifelong training in managing public scrutiny under pressure. Throughout the hall, audience members began replaying moments mentally, debating the layers of meaning. Veterans exchanged knowing glances, foreign dignitaries observed with subtle curiosity, and charity leaders whispered interpretations. The balance of attention between stage and royal box created a nuanced tension that invited speculation. It was evident that this was no ordinary ceremonial evening. The speech had subtly shifted perceptions, signaling authority, values, and unspoken expectations. By the time the final musical notes concluded, the event had undergone a quiet transformation. The ceremony's polished exterior remained intact, yet the evening's energy had shifted. What was meant to be a simple display of unity had evolved into a nuanced tableau of influence, restraint, and moral clarity. Catherine's measured poise and pointed words, paired with Camilla's controlled unease, left a lasting impression that would ripple through palace corridors long after guests departed. As guests departed, conversations remained focused on the subtle undercurrents of the evening. Reporters prepared stories, aides reflected on the strategic execution, and insiders mentally replayed each gesture. The narrative established by Catherine's speech, combined with the Queen's restrained reaction, created a lasting impression of values, authority, and careful diplomacy. The echoes of this night, subtle yet undeniable, would continue to influence perceptions and decisions for weeks to come. Even as the evening wore on, Catherine remained quietly observant. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in dignitaries, veterans, and charity workers, yet they repeatedly flicked back to the royal box. Each subtle glance reinforced her control over the atmosphere. Her calm demeanor projected authority, suggesting that her words were not just ceremonial, they carried intent. A quiet assertion of moral clarity, Camilla, aware of every nuance, adjusted her posture with careful precision. A slow, measured breath, a subtle shift in seating, and a brief tightening of her lips were all invisible to the untrained eye, but spoke volumes to palace insiders. Each gesture seemed designed to counterbalance the unspoken message Catherine had delivered, a silent struggle to maintain dignity and authority in the face of pointed scrutiny. Observers in the audience began noticing patterns. Whispers spread, speculations grew, and even casual attendees sensed that the evening had shifted. Journalists furiously scribbled notes, and dignitaries exchanged subtle glances. The focus was no longer solely on the performances or ceremonies. Catherine's carefully measured words had altered the room's energy, creating an undercurrent of tension that extended beyond the royal box. Throughout the remainder of the speeches and musical performances, Catherine employed subtle pauses and deliberate timing. Each measured gesture amplified her presence, emphasizing points already made. The audience, consciously or unconsciously, noted the rhythm of her delivery and its contrast to Camilla's occasional delays and measured reactions. Even silence, executed with intention, became a tool of influence. Though Camilla maintained outward composure, insiders noted small acts of controlled assertion. A deliberate nod, a careful adjustment of a sleeve, a glance that lingered just long enough to convey awareness. These gestures, while polite, were an attempt to reclaim some measure of control over the evolving narrative, a subtle counterbalance to the princess's quiet authority. Behind the scenes, Catherine's team reviewed the unfolding reactions. They recognized the speech's impact, noting every audience gesture, every camera angle that captured Camilla's subtle unease. The precision of her timing, the choice of language, and the understated delivery all confirmed that the speech had achieved more than expected. It had established a narrative of integrity, influence, and strategic authority. The speech's implications spread quietly but decisively through royal circles. Conversations among aides, palace officials, and visiting dignitaries reflected analysis rather than idle chatter. Catherine's emphasis on accountability and trust became a topic of private discussion, while Camilla's controlled discomfort sparked reflection on the subtle dynamics of influence, power, and perception within the monarchy. In quieter moments, Catherine and William shared brief, unspoken acknowledgments of success. Their subtle communication reflected a mutual understanding. The speech had landed precisely as intended. Meanwhile, Camilla, seated with her aides, reflected on how a single address could recalibrate perception without a single overt confrontation. Every glance, gesture, and reaction of the evening had contributed to a complex tapestry of silent diplomacy. As guests began to depart, the polished veneer of ceremony remained intact, but the impact of the speech lingered. Conversations continued, mental notes were taken, and the subtle tension between stage and royal box remained in the collective memory of those present. The evening had been transformed from a celebration of tradition to a masterclass in quiet, assertion, subtle rivalry, and the unspoken weight of authority. Even as the music softened, Catherine's presence filled the hall in a way that transcended the spoken word. She leaned slightly forward in her seat at times, her gaze scanning both audience and stage, her eyes never straying from the royal box longer than necessary. Every tilt of her head, every careful gesture of her hands, conveyed confidence and deliberate authority. Though outwardly calm, there was a silent assertion in her posture. She had set the tone of the evening, and even the queen, regal and composed as she appeared, could not ignore the subtle dominance radiating from the princess. Camilla's composure remained impeccable, yet each movement was a battle of control. Her hands, clasped loosely in her lap, flexed momentarily, her lips pressed together just enough to betray an internal tightness. Even her breathing seemed measured, as if rehearsed, to avoid the slightest display of unease. Insiders noticed these micro-expressions, reading them as the quiet struggle of a queen maintaining her authority in the face of a pointed, polite assertion. Every gesture was a calculated effort to preserve dignity, projecting control while masking subtle irritation. The audience, though engrossed in performances, began to pick up on cues they could not entirely articulate. Veterans whispered to one another, nodding at phrases that hinted at steadfastness and accountability. Diplomats exchanged careful glances, noting timing and emphasis in the princess's speech. Journalists scribbled notes with heightened intensity, sensing layers of meaning beyond ceremonial rhetoric. The hall, filled with tradition and ceremony, now held an undercurrent of intrigue, a silent tension threading through the audience as they sensed the subtle confrontation unfolding. Throughout the evening, Catherine's timing became a tool of influence. She allowed moments of silence to stretch slightly longer than expected, letting words settle, letting their weight resonate. Each pause seemed designed not merely for emphasis, but to draw attention, particularly toward the royal box. The audience, sensitive to cadence, began to lean in subconsciously. Camilla, fully aware, shifted slightly in her seat, a quiet acknowledgement of the princess's skill in wielding time as effectively as words. Camilla subtly responded in kind. A deliberate adjustment of her gown, a graceful repositioning of her hands, a brief but controlled glance toward Catherine, all performed with the precision of someone trained to mask internal tension. To the casual observer, these gestures seemed natural, but to insiders they signaled a careful negotiation of authority and perception. The queen was managing optics as meticulously as the princess had directed the narrative, each gesture a subtle counterweight to the underlying message of the speech. Backstage, aides and production staff replayed the event mentally and in